Hi, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, April 5th, 2023. Tonight's topic is what is the work and how do you do it? I hear this question a lot. In fact, my wife has asked me to do this webinar because she has clients in private practice who listen to the podcast and will ask after I mentioned about doing your work, what does your work look like? She'll talk about how difficult it is to define it. And tonight, while I feel two feeling side by side as I embark on the broadcast tonight, I'm really excited about it because I love the idea of talking about what mental health is, what mental illness is, what therapy does, and how it helps us work through that process. I'm very excited about it. I was very excited creating these slides, but I'm also challenged by it because a few things. It's such a personal, it's such a personal, specific issue for every person. And some of the things, probably the biggest challenge is that if you're a beginner to therapy or are thinking about therapy or new to this work because you have a child at Evoke or you're just getting started on your mental health and wellness journey, some of the things I might talk about might not make sense. They might even seem wrong and they might seem strange or poetic or romantic and have no real practical application. There's also not one clear place to start with that. So I beg your patience with this process as I kind of work my way through the slides tonight. As I say sometimes, for those of you listening on the podcast, you're welcome to request the slides for any of our broadcasts, and we're happy to send them to you. And tonight would be a one that I would think would be requested more than others because it's very text heavy. And really what I've just done is I've taken a lot of quotes from various therapists and people that I really admire in the field and try to build a discussion, a dialogue, a journey through these slides, through these quotes for this evening. So with that, I'm going to get started and say this. Years ago, we had some visitors come to the field. Some of you might remember, if you've been around for a long time, that somebody created a musical, a play. It's actually a play with some music off Broadway. And part of that was they came out to the field, spent time with students, spent time in groups. At one point, we had a New York Times reporter come out and spend some time with the group. And I was there on one of those visits. I drove them out to the field, dropped them off, and they were going to stay the night and stay for a couple of days. And I encouraged them, invited them to participate, sit in on the group therapy sessions. And if something came up, if it was appropriate and the therapist was asking for comments, then they were welcome to give their 2 cents into the process. So we were going through a process, and there was a moment. One of our therapists, a very gifted therapist, was conducting a group therapy session. And at one moment, one of the young men in his group was complaining, was frustrated, was angry about something from home. I don't remember the exact topic right now, but he was complaining about something. And Mike, the therapist, was listening. He was being empathic, he was being encouraging, and he was listening. And at one point, one of the visitors turned to me and said, "Is it okay?" in front of the group, "Is it okay if I say something?" And I said, "Sure." And then that person went about giving the student some advice, some kind of a mini lecture about their perspective, about how to look at the things differently than the way that he was looking at it. And after a moment, I kind of redirected back to the therapist. And then when I had a debrief with our visitors, part of what I explained to them is therapy looks invisible. You can't see therapy if you don't know what it is, if you haven't been trained in it. And Mike's listening and empathy and understanding and asking for clarifying questions to find out and discover more about what this young man's experience was, that was really the therapy. The lecture or the teaching, typically, although that can happen in therapy, of course, that is not what therapy looks like. Psychotherapy is a lot more about listening and hearing and tuning into the client's experience more than anything. And so if you're watching it, it might look like the therapist is doing nothing, but that's the magic. I don't know if I left the quote in here for this evening. If I do, we'll get to it at one point when I'm clicking through my slide deck. But one of the things that I talk about is this idea. Yeah, I did leave it in the slide deck. This idea that oftentimes when people think, even therapists think, that the goal of therapy is to give advice or to fix the client and their symptoms and their problems, that we can playfully say to them, to that therapist, I don't need advice. I don't need to be fixed. I already have parents for that. And so part of the experience in therapy is how different it is from our original context. And I'm going to talk about that quite a bit tonight. I couldn't do this broadcast tonight without describing what therapy looks like, what good therapy looks like, and in some examples, what not so good therapy looks like. So one of the things I remember my therapist sharing with me is this idea from D.W. Winnicott, one of the master therapists of all time. And Winnicott said that the false self brings the real self into therapy. I remember when she said this to me 15 years ago. And I remember at the time feeling kind of defensive. Like I said, I think it was my real self that came in here. And of course, my therapist is so gifted that she was able to apologize and just recognize, now I can see that I wasn't quite ready to hear that I had a defense that was showing itself in that interaction. But in a sense, it's true. In a sense, for all of us, what we think is therapy, if we're new to it, what we think is therapy, the kind of therapy we do at Evoke, is very different than that. And therapy becomes, over time, through the thing that you and the therapist create together, something very different years later than it is in the beginning, which makes sense, of course. If you already knew what therapy was, you wouldn't need it as much, right? If you understood all the concepts of therapy and how big of a shift, how big of a transformation being in a different kind of relationship, a different kind of context. When I describe context, I mean a relationship with somebody that's very different than anything else you've ever had in your life. Therapy is a place where you get to go and to be seen and understood. And through the process of being seen, not fixed, not a therapist's helpful anxiety to try to make your life better, but somebody who's trying to understand you. Through that process, you re-experience yourself. You re-experience yourself over time as okay. As nothing is fundamentally wrong or bad about you, but you just have unexpressed truths, unexpressed feelings, unexplored feelings. You have shame and guilt and fear that you've been taught by what we've all been told are well-meaning adults and big people, parents in our lives. And what you find in therapy is that so much of what you've been taught to be afraid of or to be ashamed of or to feel guilty about is the stuff that you need to sort out, the stuff that you need to accept and embrace and understand and integrate into you. So therapy is a place. The work is, I remember saying this to a therapist friend of mine years ago who eventually took his own life. I said to him, he kept on coming to me for advice over the years, trying to sort of make me his therapist, which I couldn't be because we were colleagues and friends, and at one point, employee and employer. And I said to him, he said, Brad, why can't you just tell me what I need to know? And he said, I have a PhD in this stuff. What's a therapist going to tell me that I don't already know? And what I said to him, it's not what the therapist tells you that's going to be the most difficult thing, probably. The most difficult thing is going to be what you tell the therapist. I had another friend who passed away from health reasons just last year. And we would share our journeys together, of course. And he was a novice in therapy, but had tried it several times and had a pretty clear idea of what his trauma history was. And at one point in one of our discussions, I said, how's therapy going? Are you still going to that therapist you told me about? And he said, no, it's a waste of time. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I just found myself going in and lying to the therapist and trying to show the therapist how cool I was, how good I was. And if I'm going to go in there and lie to somebody about who I am, what's the use? And I laughed a belly laugh. And I said to him, I said, we all do that until we don't. Until at some point we feel safe enough. We experiment with the therapist. We tell them things about ourselves. if we have an adequate one. I'm gonna talk mostly only about adequate therapists tonight, and that's my word for good therapists. Um, we tell them little things. We show them little parts of ourselves, or little parts of ourselves slip out, unbeknownst or unaware to us. And over time, the therapist has a different kind of reaction, a non-judgmental reaction, a not afraid reaction, a compassionate, inquisitive, and curious reaction. And as we experience those little moments over time, we begin to trust. And if we have an adequate one, we begin to realize that we're in a different kind of relationship, a different kind of room, having a different kind of experience than most all of us have had our entire lives. So therapy is a place, the work is a place to go and show up and tell your story. And some weeks I've shared this before. Some weeks my therapy is about talking about cases that I have, or clients, or concepts that I'm trying to teach to the clinical team. Sometimes we talk about movies. Sometimes we talk about sports or art. And then sometimes, like today, I go there and I unload a bunch of pain and frustration and anger and sadness and grief that I've been carrying, that I found no safe place to express, because if I express it to my wife, it's some of it's about her. She can be triggered, or she can be anxious to try to fix it or make me feel happy, or be frightened by my fear or frustration. I can't unload it to my children. And there aren't many friends in the world that understand what it means to really listen to people. Because again, very few of us have had this experience of being held, of being seen, of being understood, and not being fixed. Not trying to get us to get rid of the symptoms. So what therapy is in the beginning, it will be something in the end. And for many people that I talk to, the ticket into therapy is a struggling child. Sometimes it can be a struggling marriage, or other things in their life, but oftentimes in this context where I work, it can be a struggling child. And I love this quote, and I shared actually some of the Instagram accounts that I like and I pay attention to, and gave them credit for sharing these quotes. But this quote is from Daniel Siegel, the UCLA psychiatrist, world renowned, written several wonderful books. One of my very favorite parenting books, entitled Parenting from the Inside Out. And very simply, the basis of what he teaches in his parenting curriculum is this. And here's the quote: "The strongest predictor of a child's well-being is a parent's self-understanding." The strongest predictor of a child's well-being is a parent's self-understanding. And the research is exhaustive on this point and scientific on this point. And we have neurological imaging to show this point. And research has been done on the interactions between parents and children, and how that creates resiliency and mental health and well-adjusted children, and the correlation between that and how aware a parent is of themselves, which usually means really, it means that the parent realizes that they're a nincompoop a lot of the time. They realize that they're a mess, that they've got issues. I was thinking about this today. When I say we all have a mental illness, people associate something very dramatic, like psychosis, with that. In physical illness, you can have a common cold, you can have the flu, you can have COVID, or you can have cancer. Right? You can have multiple sclerosis. You can have congenital heart disease. You can have a lot of diseases. But if you have the flu, you're ill. You have an illness. And similarly, we all have a flu. We all have a common cold. We all get strep throat. Most of us have gotten COVID. And it doesn't mean that we're psychotic, but the more work you do, the more you realize your stuff, your issues, and you start to become aware of where it came from. And I'll talk more about that tonight as we talk about what it looks like. Where therapy ends up, in my experience, most of this, of course, most of what I will teach you tonight, almost all of it comes from my education in the client chair. being a client myself. I share this all the time. Very few of my professors in graduate school knew anything about what I'm talking to you about this evening. A couple did, and did their best to try to teach it to me, to us. But we weren't able to hear it or understand it. It didn't make sense to it. It was so contrary to the way that all of us are raised that we just dismissed it as they're wrong. But where therapy ends up, from my experience, is this: the greatest freedom comes when you discover that the way that you're living your life is the source of your unhappiness and your suffering. I'm going to read that again. The greatest freedom comes when you discover that the way you're living your life is the source of your suffering. But that doesn't make sense to us because we have a struggling child who's legitimately, authentically struggling with difficult and dangerous sometimes issues, sometimes even life-threatening issues. And because we've been told that love means that we're so connected to that child that we take on their suffering, and that their issues, problems, mental illness, addiction is the cause of our suffering. We don't know that it's really inside of here and that we can change our relationship to the child and their issues. I talk about in the journey of the heroic parent, the heroic parent being the one who's willing to look at themselves, to go inside of their own mind, to understand themselves, to consider how they might be contributing to the dynamic, to the process. Not cause and effect, but contributing to it, a part of it, inadvertently reinforcing things that they have no idea that they're reinforcing or teaching or modeling. And the reason they don't know is because the fish is the last one to discover water, right? It's where they come from. It's how they grew up. It's the, as I say, the soup that they were cooked in. So when someone tells us that the way that we're living our life, our relationship to ourselves, to the world, to what happens in life, to our children, to our spouses, to our colleagues, to our friends, to our community, on and on and on, that's the problem. See, what I love about this quote, this slide, is this: you have control over this. So you have no control over the community. I mean, you can influence the community, influence the world. You can make a difference, of course. But ultimately, the only thing you have any significant control over is yourself. And that's really, really hard. But that's where therapy gets to. You realize as you go to therapy, it's not my boss, it's not my employee, it's not my partner, it's not my spouse, it's not my child, it's not my neighbor, it's not my parent, not my brother or sister. It's me. I might have to change, which at sometimes might include, in some of those cases, leaving the relationship, the job, the relationship, the not talking to somebody. I'm not saying we go there lightly and we go there quickly and easily. See, years ago, when I was in therapy, and we did a lot of couples therapy, my wife and I, well, very little happened. Very little good came out of those sessions because we were so entrenched, right? Our issues were calcified, became part of our personality structure. But I was thinking about this the other day. She would say things to me or do things to me that at the time I thought were unhealthy or unfair or not right. And I would argue and fight about it very, very often. Or I would become passive aggressive or cut off or try to punish her with silence or whatever it was. I was involved in trying to change her. I thought that if I could change her, and that's essentially what most people consciously sometimes, but unconsciously will think about therapy. If I bring my child to therapy with me, if I bring my spouse to therapy with me, and the therapist can see how crazy and nutty they are and fix them, I then will be okay. Right? That's what we think sometimes. And I mentioned this, and I'll talk about this a little later. Family therapy, couples therapy, in a lot of ways, is more advanced. It it ideally would be for the more advanced participant in therapy, because in therapy where you have somebody else present, a percentage of the session won't be for your needs. In fact, your needs will be put on the shelf for a moment if the therapist is attending to your spouse or to your child or to your parent or to whomever is there with you. And that can be very frustrating and upsetting and can even turn you away from therapy because it's not a good experience. But individual therapy is for you and your needs, right? The hour is dedicated to you. So I believe in family therapy. I believe in couples therapy. I have a doctoral degree in marriage and family therapy, and run a program that teaches it and facilitates those processes. But I warn people that the foundation is individual therapy. I heard a quote the other day about the great coach John Wooden. Some of you, if you're a sports fan, might know who he was, but he was a coach for the UCLA basketball Bruins back in the 1960s. Arguably the greatest coach in all sports. I don't know the number. Won like 10 or 12 championships over the course of 15 years. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is his most famous athlete that he taught and mentored. He's a wonderful guy, wonderful philosopher, wonderful teacher, wonderful, patient, compassionate man. He's passed away now. But one of the things that he would do in the first day of the season, I said this the other night, is he would start off with teaching the players how to tie their shoes. Mind you, these are the most gifted athletes, college athletes in the United States. UCLA was the premier basketball university in the country by a long shot, by a long, long shot. And he spent time teaching them how to tie their shoes from the bottom up and taking their time. And he was trying to explain it. It starts with that kind of attention to detail. He did other things, like he had shooting practice without balls, where they would just imagine the shots going in, because he knew intuitively what we know now about mirror neurons, that when we imagine something positive happening, our brain thinks it's happening. We can build confidence by imagining the ball going in. But the point is that John Wooden, the greatest coach of all time, arguably, started off with teaching people how to tie their shoes. And I think that's what individual therapy is like. So when I talk about coming to an intensive, we obviously host couples intensives. I host many of them. I've done one with my wife not too long ago, in fact. We do family intensives, of course. And some of the most rewarding work happens in those processes. But the foundation is finding you. The foundation is understanding your history, understanding what you bring to the table. If I were describing, this is one of those moments when it's going to sound very poetic and romantic and not very concrete. But this is what I've come to. And this whole broadcast tonight is about, I have no other reason to tell you this stuff except for that I've discovered it for myself. But if you asked me, and if you said, I'll give you everything, or I'll take away everything if you don't tell me, what is the work in finding therapy? My answer would be becoming who you are. Your most authentic self. Michael Mead, another account that I follow on Instagram that I really like, he wrote it this way, this simply. He said, becoming who we truly are requires the greatest amount of change. This is the message over and over and over again. I shared with you a couple of weeks ago. Somebody recently asked me to prove to them that the attachment-based model works, which there is, like I said, exhaustive research on it. But when he said, where's your proof? I said, it's everywhere. It's in John Wooden's story, right? It's in Buddhism. It's in an AA meeting. It's in when I walk outside in nature. It's everywhere. The fundamental idea that the fundamental wound or trauma that human beings experience, the universal wound and trauma that human beings experience, according to attachment model, I'll do my best to describe it as simply as possible, is that when we did things or felt things or thought things or said things, when we expressed needs, when we were who we were, and it upset, scared, exhausted, frustrated, disappointed, or in any other way disturbed specifically our parents, but the big people around us, for starters, we as human beings are programmed to get rid of those things, to hide them, to put them under the bed and in the closet, to not be needy, to not be too loud. to not be too sensitive, to not be angry, to not be sad, whatever it is. We take those genuine parts of ourselves and we hide them away, not just from them, but from ourselves. And then therapy is reconnecting to all the parts of ourselves. And when things get hidden in the closet or under the bed, they become monsters. That's what that motif in our dreams and our stories is about. The disowned parts of ourselves become toxic monsters. They turn into things like alcoholism, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, heart disease, multiple sclerosis, autoimmune diseases, right? They toxify inside of us. They toxify in our body. They come out sideways or backwards. They come out with feelings of judgment towards others and ourselves, of hate, of anger, of fear, of shame, of guilt. Conversely, therapy looks to make friends with those parts of ourselves and find the wisdom and the gifts that are connected to those things. That's what all the metaphor. Watch movies, read books. That's what they show over and over again. That the heroine, or the hero, through their heroic journey, their journey, becomes a more authentic, larger, expansive version of themselves. And what was once something horrible in their childhood or something that they were taught or told that was wrong about them becomes the gift that they give to the world. That's what all the stories are about. So when somebody asks me what's the proof, my answer is it's everywhere. And when you see it, you can't not see it everywhere. Carl Jung, arguably one of the greatest therapists of all time, greatest writers of all time. Somebody said this about him, said, Jung emphatically states that nothing can be transformed until it is accepted. That includes our complexes, our reality, and ourselves. There is a great paradox, and it terrifies us. We think that becoming ourselves, we've been taught that becoming ourselves will lead to our destruction. And I got to tell you, it gets messy, for sure. You know what a midlife crisis is? It's kind of like that. And without some help, some support, some guidance from an adequate therapist in the ways that I described, or friends, or internal resources, it can get wild and crazy, for sure. That's the risk of it. We are told that to be ourselves will be selfish, hedonistic, self-serving, uncaring, right? That we will take and take and take. But what therapists know, what we know, what attachment theory teaches us, it's my own experience is those initial obnoxious, crazy, dysregulated phases eventually go away. And what comes on the other side is somebody more loving, more patient, more kind to themselves, more kind to others, less certain that they know all the answers. I talked about that just with my therapist today, about how the more that I grow, the more that I learn, the more therapy that I do, the less certain I am about things. And it's okay. I'm not terrified by that or upset by that. It actually brings me peace and compassion and less judgment for myself and for others. People ask, what's the trauma? Where is it? How can I discover it? Even my clients will ask me, what is it? And this is not just my idea. None of this is my idea only. This is the ideas of people who are involved in teaching the kind of transformational psychotherapy that we talk about. Trauma doesn't come to us as a recovered memory, most often, rarely, but as a feeling or a reaction to something in our present day life. Like I said, fear, guilt, rage, hate, shame, or judgments. That's what trauma looks like. And if we pay attention to it, like if I get upset with somebody who's always showing how needy they are. Even that description, of course, reveals a trauma in me, right? Which is a real trauma in me. I had a single mother that was overwhelmed, and to need was to suffer for me because she was incapable of supporting us as much as we needed. So I learned that need was bad, that I had to get rid of neediness. But guess what? I bled my needs over everybody in my life. Still do sometimes, of course, but did much, much more so when I was unaware of that disowned part of myself. At any rate, we see somebody who's needy. I'll just use that example because it's my trauma. And when we react to them with judgments, with frustration, with anger, we can, if we pay attention to that and talk about in therapy, we can over time start to trace it back. And what happens is you don't remember, I've said this many times, you don't remember things in your childhood that you forgot. You see them differently. I can see my childhood and my mother with so much more clarity today than I could when I was in it by a long shot, or than I did when I was just out of it. Because of my work, I know who my mother was and what she did. Not all of it, of course. I'm still working. It's going to be my life's work, but I can see it. So what therapy does is it gives you new eyes and new ears. I remember explaining that to somebody about the Journey of the Rogue Parent right after it came out. It's not about fixing kids. It's about getting new eyes and new ears to be able to see and hear them and ourselves more clearly. So the work is telling your story to an empathic, capable, patient, non-judgmental, non-anxious person. I'm going to say that again. The work is telling your stories, your daily stories, the small, big, and everything in between stories, your feelings, the things that you're afraid you'll be judged for, the things that you're sure if you tell a therapist, they're going to tell you how wrong or unhealthy or pathological it is. That if you told it to your mother or your father or your spouse or your friends or whomever, your teachers in school, your peers, that they would respond with disgust or fear. And the human reaction to somebody responding even to ourselves with fear is not that that person's afraid, but the reaction is, the human reaction is, something's wrong with me. But when you have a different experience with a psychotherapist, you start to realize, oh, actually their reactions aren't about me, they're about them. I'm just being me. I don't know if I told this story or not, but it's relevant and it's recent and it's powerful, and it was a learning moment for me that I couldn't see. One of my most difficult things, I can do public speaking, obviously. That's what I do for a living. And I can speak to virtually any size crowd in any context, if it's in the subject area that I study, that I'm interested in, that I'm passionate about. I've always been able to do that, actually, my whole life. One thing I do not like to do when I'm feeling raw emotion, like at a funeral, for example, I don't like to speak. I've learned that I won't do that anymore, because the presentation Brad and the grieving Brad are two different people in a sense. And I want to grieve privately, not in a closet, but not in front of a large crowd. And so I have an aversion to showing real deep and raw emotions to folks. At any rate, that's the history. So I'm at a Broadway show a couple weeks back. It's the Neil Diamond show called Beautiful Noise. I love it. It was a spiritual experience for me. It was the music from my childhood that my mother played over and over again. The lead actor in it was and is Will Swenson, a friend of mine. So I had that connection, and I'm so happy for him that he got the role, and he's incredible at it. I am biased, but he is exceptional at it. And Will and I had a close friend. In fact, I'd mentioned him earlier. He was the one that stopped going to therapy and passed away for health reasons last year. He dedicated the play in the playbill to our friend Peter. So Will and I had this mutual close friend. So I'm sitting there in the show with my family in New York City, watching the show. I'm getting tears because it's the music of my childhood. The whole play is a therapy session. And the songs are the story of Neil Diamond's life, and they break in and out of that, of course. And the therapy is actually pretty decent. And I'm remembering that Peter was on his way to see Will in the show when he started feeling sick and didn't get on the plane and went back home, ended up in the hospital, and never left the hospital until he passed away. And Peter was Will's biggest fan. Went to everything that Will did, small, big, everything in between. Went to his. They have a long history. They actually made a movie together called Sons of Provo. It's a mockumentary on boy bands and Mormonism. Anyway, I'm feeling Peter, and I'm knowing that he would like to see this. Right? I'm going to get emotional talking about it. So I'm watching the show. I'm having this incredible experience on so many different levels. And afterwards, I go to meet with Will outside. And after Will does his thing with the fans, I'm meeting across the street with his wife and a couple of their friends. And I am just overwhelmed with emotion. In fact, one of the gentlemen that we were visiting with while we were waiting for Will to come over said, "What'd you think?" And I just was full of tears, but couldn't talk. And I felt so ashamed and bad and uncomfortable. And later on, after we left, I couldn't really compose myself and couldn't really talk. And I kept thinking, he must think that this is the strangest thing in the world for me to be so overcome with emotion after watching a Neil Diamond musical. I tried to get the words out to explain the connection with Peter and what was going on for me. But I'm sharing this with my family later on that evening after we're eating cheesecake at Junior's. And my daughter, the wise daughter that I have, the one that some of you know who does a wonderful job coaching and intensives, she said, "Dad, it wasn't you. He was uncomfortable. The gentleman that you were talking to, he was uncomfortable." And she said to me, if somebody came out of a show and you were on the other side of the equation, you asked how they were doing, and they shared with you that it was connected to the loss of a dear friend and that it brought up a lot of emotions, how would you react? And I said, I would be so connected to that. I'd be so present with that person, so honored to bear witness to somebody's real, authentic, deep feelings. And she said, exactly. She said, you took on his reaction as yours. And she was right. It's a long story to explain. That's the work. The work tells you that what people think and feel about you, how they react to you, tells you more about them than it does about you. Don Miguel Ruiz, the one who wrote the Four Agreements that so many people have read, millions and millions of folks have read, one of his agreements is to not take things personal. And what he means is, if somebody loves you and admires you, that's about them. And if somebody hates you or despises you, that's about them. Yes, there's feedback and there's things to look at in all of our interactions. But to take it on like I was that night was part of the work that I still need to do. Part of the work that I'm still working on. Alice Miller, in my opinion, one of the most important books that's ever been written about children and humans ever, in 1979 originally. In the opening page of the drama The Gifted Child, she said, she's a psychoanalyst, so psychoanalysis is the one way of talking about attachment-based therapy. She said, experience has taught us that we have only one enduring weapon in our struggle against mental illness, the emotional discovery of the truth about the unique history of our childhood. That's how we figure it out. You see what happened to you. The book that Oprah and Dr. Perry just released, or Perry, I'm not sure which it is. That's what they're talking about, what happened to you. And yes, we all come with different brains, some more diverse than others. We all come with a different nervous system, some more sensitive than others. So there's the given, and that contributes to the process. But then our experience, the experience that we have in life with the big people and then with our peers and teachers in our community, layered on top of whatever we come with intrinsically, that becomes our story. That's the thing to explore. Really, the work is more about unlearning. I thought about that all day as I was creating these slides. And one of my favorite quotes about this is from a teacher that says, enlightenment is a destructive process. It has nothing to do with becoming better or being happier. Enlightenment is the crumbling away of untruth. It's seeing through the facade of pretense. It's the complete eradication of everything we imagine to be true. And that's why very few people do it. That's my words, that last phrase. Enlightenment is terrifying. It produces shame and guilt. It rocks relationships, sometimes destroys them, because who we become is somebody that's not compatible with old interactions and old patterns and old roles. One of my favorite comments ever made by a client at an intensive was when I first started doing this work, and it took me a while to hear it. That's what people tell me all the time. It took me a while. But at one time through this work, I realized that a core belief that I had held was just simply not true, and that I had to let it go. And just after that thought, this participant said, I became terrified because I realized that might be true of a whole lot of other beliefs. I remember when I read the drama, The Gifted Child, one of those professors that was trying to teach me about this gave it to me, my chairperson, Leslie Feinauer. She gave it to me my first year of my PhD. I already had a master's degree. Nobody in my master's degree taught me any of this. And she gave it to me. And I remember it's only about 110 pages, something like that. It's not very long, but it's dense. And I remember being 20, 30 pages in and thinking, oh my gosh, there is so much unconscious material, so much energy beneath the surface that is really driving my life. And it's going to take my entire life to work that out. It was a daunting realization, but one that I ultimately was unwilling to give up and shy away from. Enlightenment is unlearning. Jamie Gill, my therapist, also literally a genius, written, I've lost track of the books, 40 books, something like that. I have a few of her quotes tonight. One of her first books, Forms of Life. She said, part of the business of psychotherapy is to discover and create alternate experiences for thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs. This is undertaken in the service of freeing people to be able to re-experience themselves in a safe but different context. The virtue of talking to an empathic and accepting person who has a different base is that it quickly illuminates one's own. What was automatic and unconscious is noticed and discussed. The world is allowed to become one of noticeable constructions. In other words, we start to realize when we have this different experience with a different kind of person that the whole construct that we grew up in wasn't true. It was just somebody's version of life, our parents. And that came in part from their parents and so on and so forth. But when you have this different kind of experience, like I cite in The Audacity to Be You and often on these podcasts, when Jean Valjean and Les Mis experienced the forgiveness from the bishop after he had stole the silver from him, and incredible grace that the bishop showed to him, this paroled prisoner, that was the catalyst for his transformation. That's what people are talking about. That's the cure. And it's really hard for us parents because we over-identify with our kids. We think our job is to control them. And we believe that our job is to create them to be good people. But good people are only part of a person, right? The goal is to become whole, not good. J.D. Gill says in another book, the experience of seeing one's base from a different perspective can be profound. One way this happens is by allowing ourselves to be honest and open with someone who does not react the way our parents did. For example, what was, quote, very bad at home is now nothing. This difference in experience allows for the realization things could be different. One's assigned position in one's past is not necessarily one's assigned position in the universe. So you go to therapy and you confess aspects, stories about your horrible, rotten self. And if you have an adequate therapist, they will say, yep, that's how you are sometimes. That's how people are sometimes. And the shock of that non-reaction wakes you up to realize that everything you've been taught about right and wrong, good and bad, doesn't make sense anymore. And that the cure to this whole process is compassion. That's what takes away the shame and the guilt. Exposure to a compassionate, grace-filled person, experiencing that over and over again, is what melts away the shame. The defense, and the defense is the mental illness, right? By definition. The defense is a protective barrier that we put up against parts of ourselves that we've learned are unacceptable. Dr. Gill says psychotherapy of any significant sort requires the courage to face the darkness about oneself. Darkness in psychotherapy terms and Jungian terms, and Dr. Gill in my terms, it's not bad or evil. It's dark because it's hidden. It's unconscious. It's the shadow. It's in the closet. It's been repressed or disowned or split off, ignored. We are in denial that we have it. Psychotherapy of any significant sort requires the courage to face the darkness about oneself. For example, that which lies beyond what I know, or that is what lies that which lies beyond what I know. One must give up control and allow oneself to have a different kind of experience. This new experience is the element that allows me to develop a new point of view, so I can see myself in my world from a different place. The result of this transformation is profound life-changing. I have crossed over to being able to know what I could not possibly have known before. It is the crossing that makes us human. The work is to become human, fallible, imperfect, whole, not good. Like Jung said, I would rather be whole than good. Like Ram Dass says, we can't fix the feeling of unlovable by saying that we are lovable, or fix the feeling that we are bad with we are good. That keeps the world at a level of polarities. That's the problem thinking right there. What we replace I am bad and I am unlovable with is I am. I am sometimes wonderful. I am sometimes horrible. I am sometimes courageous and I am sometimes afraid and run from my problems. I'm sometimes generous and I'm sometimes greedy. I am. And again, because the way that humans are, because of how much people want to control people's behavior and control who people are and prevent people from getting hurt, right? They instill fear into us about those parts of ourselves that could cause us problems, could get us into trouble. They tell us that if we don't punish that thing or make it go away, then we're going to create all kinds of problems for ourselves and for others. But it's the taking back and the reintegration of those parts, becoming human, becoming whole, that makes us mentally well and healthy. And we never get to a place of perfectness, because perfectness and goodness are not only unattainable, but the using those concepts as ideals is the poison, not the cure. That's why the enlightened people will tell you how horrible they are on a consistent basis to model for you what the work looks like. You listen, like I said many times, you listen to the Dalai Lama, he will make fun of himself throughout his talks as he sprinkles messages of peace and compassion and love. But the place that starts is with you. And where that comes from is having an experience where somebody can love your horrible, rotten self. A patient, empathic, non-anxious, non-controlling therapist. And then you realize that the things you've been taught and believed about human being and about relationships are all wrong. I mentioned this earlier, the therapy secret. Family therapy or couples therapy will at best meet 50% of your needs, but individual therapy is for you. So make sure you are well taken care of before you walk into a family or a couple session, because a portion of that, of even well-facilitated couples or family therapy, is likely going to be triggering. Remember that. A portion of even well-facilitated family or couples therapy is likely to be triggering to you. So make sure that those uh, those pursuits, family and couples therapy, are resting on a foundation of your own psychotherapy, your own work. J.D. Gill said, the therapist or guide we choose must not duplicate the wounds of the past. Thus, if the therapist or guide knows what is right for us and manipulates us to achieve these treatment goals, it is abuse, plain and simple. And it's hard to see how good abuse ever cures bad abuse. Or as I said it recently on social media, if your therapist tries to fix you, you can say to them, I already have parents, I don't need another one. Because that's what we do. And I'm not saying that to pick on you, I'm saying that as a confession. It's something that's taken me a while to realize that I still stumble over, still struggle with. We look to our past. This is from the Audacity to Be You. We look to our past, to our roots, not for excuses, but for understanding. And when understanding is found, there is grace that comes. We don't look back and get stuck there. We look back so we can move through it all. We look back so we can heal and live. It's possible to look to our past and our wounds without falling into a victim's mindset. It's not a search for blame, but rather a search for understanding and self-compassion. Our aversion, I know this might not seem true, but it tends to be true. Our aversion at looking to our past and to our parents may be because we are still trying to protect them. We are still carrying around our parents' defenses. Again, another quote from Michael Meade. Well, actually, it's a quote from Carl Jung that he shared. We will become our opposite if we do not learn to accommodate the opposition within us. Or as Sigmund Freud said, a thing which has not been understood inevitably reappears. Like an unlaid ghost, it cannot rest until the mystery has been resolved and the spell broken. I mean, he discovered psychotherapy, essentially. Virtually invented it. And what he found was that these people that were experiencing physical symptoms had trauma stories that were unexplored. And once they were explored, their physical symptoms lifted, sometimes completely. And we know that now, and we can talk about it scientifically now, but he was discovering it without the assistance of the technology that we have today by just watching and paying attention. And I see the same thing in myself first, and then, of course, in the people that I love and serve professionally. Alan Watts, a great teacher of Eastern religion, specifically Buddhism, said, when you find out that there was never anything to be on the dark side to be afraid of, nothing is left but to love. It's true. And I love what Charles Bukowski says in a much more poetic way. Don't fight your demons. Your demons are here to teach you lessons. In other words, your reactions, your trauma, your weaknesses, your self-medicating, your alcohol usage, your marijuana usage, your overeating, your workaholism, whatever it is. Don't fight your demons. Your demons are here to teach you lessons. Your children. Sit down with your demons and have a drink and chat and learn their names and talk about the burns on their fingers and the scratches on their ankles. Some of them are very nice. That's in essence the fundamental idea tonight, is that our kind of psychotherapy, when I talk about the work, it is this. Don't change your drinking. Don't change your overeating or undereating. Don't try to fix your nervous tic, right? But listen to them and follow them like a spiritual, emotional, psychological trail of breadcrumbs back to the source. Because our gifts and our wounds, like I said, they lie down beside each other. Instead of thinking of your symptom as a problem, whatever the symptom is, think of your child's symptom. Think of the description of behaviors that led you to send them here. Instead of thinking of your symptom as a problem, you can think of it as the solution to a problem. And then you can ask yourself, what problem is it solving? That's really what it is. You're obsessing, you're controlling issues, your reactivity issues, your anxiety, your depression. Instead of thinking of those as problems, think of them as solutions to a deeper problem. And then get about the work of discovering what that is. And it's possible. Emma, my daughter, said, and this is relevant on a profound level because I am the family. Breaking free from my dysfunctional family patterns brings a lot of guilt. I need help to carry it. I go to therapy so my therapist can help me carry the guilt. I've told the story, but I love to repeat it here. When Harriet Lerner, when I was listening to her speak, and she was asked the question after giving a beautiful talk on shame for an hour and a half, she was asked by the moderator, "How do you deal with shame in therapy?" And she paused thoughtfully and gave a profound answer. She said, "I think you're just asking me how I do therapy. That's all we're treating, you guys, is shame and fear and what they look like as defenses and mental health symptoms, mental illness symptoms. Once the shame and the fear and the guilt recedes, there's nothing else to worry about. We sort it out. We problem solve. We easily take in new skills and new ideas and new ways of behaving. It takes a long time, though. The early phases of this spiritual awakening of the work will inevitably include feeling lost and ungrounding. And doesn't ungrounded. I'm going to read that again because I butchered it. The early phases of a spiritual awakening will inevitably include feeling lost and ungrounded. And how else could it be if you're unlearning the template, the rules of life, the roles that what a person should be, what a person should do, what a person should think, what a person should feel? If you're unlearning all the shoulds, it gets a little bit scary and crazy. And it can cause a great deal of disruption in your life. You can do some crazy things. In Brene Brown's very first talk on the TED platform, where she talked about shame, the one that made her really famous, she described that she was going through having an emotional breakdown. And she chuckled when she said, "My therapist called it a spiritual awakening." And it is the same thing. As you do this work, it gets a little bit spooky. Because the old things that kept you in check are now set aside. They go the way of the air, of the wind. I like this quote from The Audacity to Be You because it speaks to this idea about being human. Lastly, I was talking about what boundaries are, and I say, lastly, we can say that we are sorry when we fail. Every parent has limits, and every child will discover the ends of those limits. We can say sorry when we fall short of the ideal. And with this, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all, what it means to be human. You want to show your child how to make an amends, how to apologize, how to be accountable? Model it for them. And I know, again, parent after parent tells me when I introduce that idea to them that the child is going to use that against them. And they might try. But when you shifted your consciousness to this not being a competition about who's better or gooder or righter, and you shifted to the work of becoming a self, which is the work, becoming who you are, then there's no competition anymore. Then you're not participating in that old game. So the outcomes of the work is freedom from unconscious obligations. Think about that phrase. Freedom from unconscious obligations, from the shoulds and the shouldn'ts. There are things that you think that you should do, should think, should feel, should be. And when you get rid of the shoulds, you'll find peace and freedom and happiness and more love and clearer boundaries. But it takes a lot of work to undo all of that. We don't get stricter boundaries necessarily. Sometimes we do, but we get better boundaries. Or as I wrote in the typo there, better bounders. We get better boundaries. Freedom from trauma responses, knee-jerk responses, unconscious responses. We get relief from shame and guilt. We know ourselves. We see others clearly. We have greater love and compassion for self and others. We become who we are. We become ourselves. We become more resilient. We learn to embrace uncertainty and not knowing. We have less judgment for ourselves and for others. We see ourselves in others. We have a clear awareness of what it means to be human and what it means to relate to another person in love. I shared this image that Joseph Campbell used to describe the journey. where he drew a circle representing borrowing from an idea from Plato about the soul. And he drew a line across the middle of the circle, just about 2/3 of the way up. In that top third of the circle, he drew a square where he said, that's the ego, who we think we are, our conscious mind. And in the bottom half of the circle, in the center of the circle, the larger part of the circle, he drew a round circle. And he said, that's who we really are. And the way that I think about therapy, I actually have this tattoo on my left shoulder, not with the words that I have on this slide, but I have this tattoo on my left shoulder. What we try to do is we try to move that line down. We try to become more conscious. Because the things that are driving our behaviors, they're in the back of the bus, out of our eyesight. The fuel that drives us to react is largely unconscious. I wrote these 3 keys. One day I was trying to think, what does it look like? What does it sound like? And these are the 3 ideas I came up with for successful therapy. And I call them the 3 keys to enlightenment. Key number 1, we learn to be okay with being wrong and get really good at losing. When somebody feels good about themselves, they're okay to be wrong. When somebody doesn't feel good about themselves, they struggle with being wrong. Makes sense, right? Key number 2, come to know your darkness and remain on speaking terms with your mental illness. The more work you do, the deeper the basement goes. I always say, I arrive at this point, it happens to me all the time continually, where I think I've discovered the bottom basement of my horrible, rotten self. And after I wander around in that deep, dark basement, I find a flight of stairs going down even lower. But like was said in The Godfather, keep your friends close, keep your enemies even closer. Keep your virtues and your strengths and your gifts close. But get to know your enemies, the weaknesses, the blind spots even more. Because they're the things that are going to get you, that are going to kick you from behind. Key number 3, learn how to die again and again. Old contexts, beliefs, and relationships. Oftentimes in storytelling and mythology, in stories about this journey, death is the motif for letting go of old versions of ourselves. Right? The idea that if you're the same person today that you were 20 years ago, in a sense, you've wasted 20 years. If you're the same person 10 years from now, 5 years from now that you are today, you might be wasting those years. Jamie wrote in a new book, quoting the philosopher Pascal, saying, uncertainty is the only evidence we have for growth. The reason is simple, she said. If one is certain, no further study is required. We learn to die. We learn to let go of old things. My broadcasts, my webinars, not even close to the same they were 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I was all about teaching about diagnoses and clinical tools and skills, and it was very mechanical. It was intelligent, it wasn't stupid, but it didn't have the soul to it. Didn't have my work to it. Didn't have my personal growth that I've had over the last 15 years to it. I love this next quote, this next idea. Einstein said that you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. That's that same quote about that Ram Dass says you can't counteract the feeling of I am bad with I am good. Jung himself noted, James Hollis said, Jung himself noted the frequent disappointment to the ego. Quote, I have treated many patients who were conscious of the cause of their complexes. Complexes are like this pattern of behavior. It involves belief systems, reactions, roles that we play, unconscious patterns that are pretty solidified. I've treated many patients, he said, who were conscious of the cause of their complexes down to the last detail without having been helped in any way by this insight. So it's not just a knowing, it's an experience. And I wrote, the concept, if I knew better, I would do better, is an obvious fallacy. Everybody knows it, but everybody loves the quote. If I knew better, I would do better, is an obvious fallacy. Insight and tools help, but a key to growth is feeling better about yourself. improving the relationship that you have with yourself. Really, the quote should read, if I felt better, I would do better. If it was about knowing, I would be an exceptionally great, nearly perfect parent because I've spent 30 years studying this stuff. But obviously, I'm not. Right? I spend every day thinking about psychology. It is my love, my passion, my bliss. I'm reading books all the time. I'm teaching to you all the time. I'm thinking about it all the time. I'm having discussions with my therapist wife and my therapist children, my children who are therapists. Mornings, I love it. It feeds me. If it was about knowing, I'd be a saint walking on water, but it's not about knowing. It's about healing. From The Audacity to Be You, I said this. Joseph Campbell, the foremost American expert on mythology, explained that the purpose of the heroic journey illustrated in our myths and our stories is to describe a transformation of consciousness. The kind of change he is talking about is more than any new skill or tool can provide. The shift is fundamental. It's a different way of being. This transformation is even beyond an explanation. It is difficult to put into words or to explain to another person, which is why it is often illustrated through stories or examples. The story, or in Campbell's work, the myth, shows us how it would look and sound if we experienced this change in ourselves. The lessons from the prophets are vertical, meaning about depth, more than horizontal, meaning about time. It's not about the past and the future. It's about the depth of the human soul, right? That's what Joseph Campbell taught and discovered. The prophets see different levels or layers of life. They don't offer us necessarily a history lesson or a glimpse into the future. They provide us with a deeper meaning to our lives. I was putting this together looking at slides and quotes that I have from people. On all of these quotes, I have dozens of quotes from various people. I'm listening to the book I'm reading right now, that I'm listening to right now is Rick Rubin's book on art. The Creative Act, I think is what it's called. Rick Rubin is this muse that helps people like Jay-Z and others. They call him in when they're feeling stuck, and he helps facilitate. He knows nothing about music, doesn't play an instrument, but people bring him in, all kinds of artists, to help themselves break free of when they're stuck creatively. And he teaches all of this stuff because it's all the same. So what's the take home? Go to therapy. Do it. Start wherever you like. Start wherever you like. It might start off simple. Find a therapist. Find a therapist who can see you. Find a therapist who's not anxious to fix you. Find a therapist who can apologize when they make a mistake or say something you don't like. Find a therapist that is comfortable enough with themselves so they can be imperfect. Find a therapist that doesn't have all the answers about what you should and shouldn't do, but wants to hear about what you feel. Find a therapist that's not trying to fix you, but trying to find your story. Be a critical therapist when it comes. Be a critical thinker when it comes to choosing a therapist. And therapy will change over time. Why wouldn't it? You're changing over time. I think the greatest barrier to the work is the pace. I started playing guitar in the pandemic, like a lot of people did. I'd always joked with my students in the wilderness saying, I would do anything to play guitar except for take lessons and practice. Or the other day I said to my daughter, she was talking about learning Spanish, and I said, I would do anything to learn Spanish except for study it and practice. And, they used to get a laugh out of that, but I was trying to illustrate a point. So I started guitar lessons around May of 2020, right around then. And I asked my teacher, I said, how much do I need to practice in a day? And he said, 15 minutes is plenty. 5 is fine. And I realized something later. It's not the 5 or the 15 minutes that's the hard. 5 or 15 minutes is nothing. It's the everyday that's the hardest thing. Or as often as possible. That's the hardest thing. The hardest part about therapy is that it doesn't fix it in a microwave minute. That the ahas that we have don't change our whole personality. That the lessons that we learn don't alter who we are, because the problem isn't cognitive. The problem isn't just not having information. Again, if it was about having information, I would be. There are very few people who study more. I mean, there are people that study it more than me, but not a lot. Right? My good friend and colleague and clinical director Travis Slagle is on here. He studies it a great deal, more than most human beings on earth. If it were about studying it, he'd be walking on water too. But it's a work in progress. And the real work is realizing you're a lovable, beautiful wreck. Not a shameful wreck, not a disgusting wreck, just a wreck. Just a beautiful, absolutely beautiful, made from stardust disaster. And finding peace with that. You hang out with somebody who's found peace with their horrible, rotten self, who's learned to love and accept their horrible, rotten self because somebody else loved it first. Just see what it feels like to be around them. See how nurtured and connected and loved and present the experience is with them. The greatest barrier to the work is the pace. And probably finding a good therapist too, because so many therapists who haven't done their work don't know what it is. Or they're just performing a very narrow task within the great whole of psychology of therapy. I talk about the Buddha and self-care. It's not about becoming more loving. That will happen. It's not becoming more present. That happens in the work. It's not about becoming more compassionate and less judgmental and less angry. That will happen. But what do you have to do? Remember, the Buddha sat under the tree for a long, 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 long time by himself. In other words, he did something hard. And the hard thing that we have to do is to confront and deal with our guilt and our shame and our fear that we've inherited. When Emma said that breaking free of family dysfunction causes her a great deal of guilt, and that's why she goes to therapy, so a therapist can help her carry that, because it's a heavy load. If you take care of yourself, you can be the Buddha too, Buddha-like. You can be like the Dalai Lama or Gandhi or Mother Teresa, right? Because they've overcome the guilt and the shame to an extent where they can take care of themselves. And they know that's the foundation. The hard part is not loving. That just comes. The hard part is dealing with the guilt and the shame of self-care, of letting people down, of disappointing people, of dropping balls, of failing. You make peace with those aspects of yourself enough to be able to take care of yourself, to take a time out when you need it, to remove yourself from a conversation when you feel upregulated, to admit vulnerability when you're overwhelmed or taxed or stressed out or feeling threatened or whatever it is. When you make peace with the fear and the shame and the guilt, love just comes. The hard work is being able to be who you are and walk away and take care of yourself. Then when you show up, the love flows. My son kind of explained this to me, not using the golf analogy, but my friends used to always say that golf bets, you might not know this if you don't play golf, but in golf, to compete with others, each of you have a handicap, which is a number that gets subtracted at the end of the round from the score so that people at different levels can compete together. So I might be, back in the day, my best handicap was a 7. That was the peak of my golfing career. It usually averaged around a 12. So at the end of a round, I would take away 12 strokes. And my good friend Steve Kirk, who works for us, his handicap is a 2 or a 3, which is amazing. Maybe even a 1 sometimes. So I would take 12 strokes. He would take his 2 strokes. We would say there's 10 between us. So at the end of a round, I get to take 10 off of my score. So golf bets are won or lost on the first tee when you're setting up the handicap. You can't be the Buddha or be the compassionate, patient, containing, careful, intentional, wise, regulated, calm, capable, parent that you want to be unless you face your guilt and take care of yourself first, unless you face your fear, unless you confront all the things you've been taught about life and yourself and do what you need to do so then you can be that person you want to be. That's the trick. That's the work. And the way you discover that is by spending time with somebody who gets it and who welcomes your horrible self as you are and loves it and understands it. If it was easy, everybody would do it. And most don't. But the great thing about the people that I work with is that they have this motivation where people are willing to do just about anything for, which is their children and their children's safety. So they get into this work, they find themselves in a podcast because it's offered at Evoke. And I say crazy things that don't make sense and seem convoluted and abstract, sometimes heretical, like heresy. And then eventually it starts to click. And then they see it. And then that's all they can see. Everything you want is on the other side of fear. The cave you fear to enter, Joseph Campbell says, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. The heroic journey is inward. The heroic parent is the parent who's willing to say, I might have some part in this. The things that I'm seeing may, in fact, be some sort of response to the inherited, the generational inheritance of mental health issues. And sending a child to treatment wakes the parent who is sensitive up to that fact. Wakes the parents up to themselves. And it's joyful for everybody. All right, folks, that's it for tonight. Went a little bit over. Just going to go over the upcoming slides. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be, are available on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, the best thing I think you can do to really launch or accelerate your work, we've created the Finding You Intensive for that purpose. It is my best effort, our best effort, Travis's best effort at trying to give you the thing that we think will make the biggest difference in your life. April 19th is the next one. I think there's maybe one spot available. April 19th through 23rd is our next in-person offering. We also have an online offering, May 19th through 21st, half the time, a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. We also have a Returning to You. If you've been to a Finding You or two, you can come back and do it again, do more of it. Returning to You, October 11th through 15th. And we have a Finding You weekend in the UK. There might be a spot left, although it might be filled. June 23rd through 25th. You can contact intensives@evoketherapy.com to find out about any of these. We also have custom Finding Connection intensives for couples and Finding Families for families. If you want support, we have support groups for current and alumni families. April 6th, tomorrow night, is the next offering, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We have one a week where you get to share and hear from other parents. Once a month, we have a meeting for alumni only. April 25th at 6:30 p.m. is that offering. And then once a month, we have an intensive support group for our alumni of the intensives program. April 11th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering. Contact Sarah D, SARAD, at evoketherapy.com or visit evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more information. If you would like a coach that can help you with this process, who's trained in the attachment model, for parents, for couples, for families, for individuals, for anything, they can do it virtually from anywhere that you're at. Clarifying boundaries, communication skill building, parent-family dynamics, transitioning home, supporting you in your transition to having your child come home after treatment, guilt and shame, psychedelic-assisted integration. If you've done psychedelic-assisted therapy, then we don't provide that, but we do provide integration therapy. So the whole host of options. There's 45 therapists or coaches to choose from. We ask all current parents to attend 6 of any combination of the following 12-step support groups: alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, adultchildren.org. Also refugerecovery.org or NAMI.org, National Alliance on Mental Illness, have free classes and resources in the local community. All these broadcasts are available on Spotify or your favorite podcast app. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast and listen there. Or you can go to soundcloud.com on your computer and listen there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the broadcast with the slides and the pictures and the video of me talking. You can find Evoke Therapy Programs or me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can also find the Intensives program on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each week. If you want to give back financially to people that can't afford treatment or therapy, and you can earmark your donation for a specific population if something really touches your heart, or for a specific program if you'd like to, you can donate to choosementalhealth.org, sky'sthelimitfund.org, or the Evoke Family Foundation.org. All of these are partners with us, and we work with all of them. All right, folks, I'm grateful to share this with you tonight. I hope it answered some of the questions. I hope it wasn't too abstract. I hope it had a feeling of some practical application. My next broadcast, I'll take any questions left over from tonight or any live ones that come. You can also always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com for questions, suggestions, feedback, or to request copies of the slide deck that I use during these. The next broadcast will be April 11th next week at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. That's next Tuesday, and that'll be a question and answer for Evoke family and friends. So I look forward to that. I hope this was a helpful point of contact, and for and on behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thank you for showing up and being willing to do your work. This is a part of it. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.